Greetings, ladies and gentlemen of YouTube. I'm Cipher, and this is the Devil's Advocate Debate Club. Welcome back. Today, in light of the recent rounds of censorship, I'd like to talk just a little bit more about the idea of mandatory happiness and touch on something that I missed in my last video, which is the idea of herd immunity to mental illness, much the way that vaccines work. So, vaccines and herd immunity work in the sense that a certain percentage of the population is allergic to vaccines and thus cannot be vaccinated. However, this percentage is low, and as long as everyone else is vaccinated, the diseases have no way to spread and won't end up infecting the people who were not vaccinated either. This is called herd immunity. Well, in my last video, I talked about the idea of mandatory happiness, where, if everyone was happy all the time, wouldn't it make people happier? You're happier when you're around happy people, studies show, so, why not smile instead of frown? Well, this can lead to authoritarian and depressing regimes. For instance, in North Korea, if you don't applaud loudly enough, you can be jailed. Oh, it's just my little dog. Anyway, though, the idea of herd immunity to mental illness struck me as something that just almost seems too logical not to be viable, but which, anytime it's been tried in reality or even in fiction without the use of drugs to enforce it, has been an abject failure. Probably because it takes away a basic part of human will and freedom, and, well, the human mentality just fights for those things. But what if it were a slow progression? Rather than trying to enforce happiness all at once, rather than, taking away all of that liberty at one time and saying be happy or death, happiness or death, basically. Lots of people would put on smiles, but they wouldn't be real, and eventually there would be a revolt. What if they took those liberties as slowly as possible? Let's look at hate speech laws. The entire purpose of hate speech laws is to keep you from making other people feel bad or feel unhappy. See, suicide rates among certain communities are high, and there is certainly, I would say, a correlation between high rates of bullying and high rates of suicide. A lot of people point towards the transgender community, which is fair to say, because in many areas they are still persecuted, and they have probably the highest rate of suicide other than, I think, a certain type of paranoid schizophrenics. So, since they get talked about a lot, let's also bring up the, I believe, second highest rate of suicide among, any of the social groups that get talked about in the media. White men, especially white men in Britain, where it's become, I believe, among certain age groups at least, the number one killer of young white men. And studies show that on social media, on Twitter, white straight men are bullied the most. So they are bullied the most and have one of the highest rates of suicide. Correlation is not causation, but there may certainly be a correlation between the nasty things that we say to people and their likelihood of killing themselves. You never know when you say something mean to someone if that's the last mean thing that they're mentally capable of hearing without that breakdown. But that's not your fault. People need to be free to say mean things to each other because there's no end point. once people become insulated against a certain level of mean things, so once like words are taken out, people will just find other ways to be mean to each other. Say hate speech becomes so limiting that you basically can't speak to one another without risking hate speech. And so you just start frowning and glaring at people you don't like. You no longer have words that you can legally use to express your displeasure with someone, because that might hurt their feelings, so they've all been made illegal. And so you glare at them. Well, how long before people who have never had bad words said to them, who've grown up in this new era of hate speech laws, decide that, hey, we can't say mean things to each other. Why should we be able to express meanness to each other in other ways? Why should we be able to frown at each other? Wouldn't we all be happier if we all just smiled and were nice to each other? And if everyone liked each other, and if everyone were good people, or just nice people, that might be the case, but it's not. We're all individuals. Humans are not a monolith who all feel, act, or experience things the same way. We need our individual freedoms so that we can express our individuality. And the more that gets curtailed, I think the higher you'll find the suicide rates get. Now, there are places which have curtailed many of these rights where the suicide rates are low. At least according to reporting, they're fairly low in North Korea. This could just be the government lying, or it could be because there, at least for a long time, and I believe still, members of your family can be punished if you commit suicide. I think they might have gotten rid of that in recent years, but for a long time that was the case, and so it would create, I would think, a fear beyond yourself for killing yourself. That's not a good way to keep people alive in your society. It's authoritarian and terrifying. And hate speech laws are the first step down that path. Or maybe not even the first step, but a big, recent, and obvious one. So, if it were done in small steps, could society accept enforced happiness? I don't think so. I think that people are too individual to be forced to homogenize at that level. I think what you'll really be doing is taking away people's defenses to the harshness of the real world. People who've never had anything mean said to them, who make it into their adulthood, just won't be able to deal with that first insult. And, in real life, people are insulting. There are going to be times, no matter how strict the hate speech laws get, that people are just mean to you. Some people are just mean. And, sometimes they might have a legitimate beef with you. You might have slighted them in a way that you don't know, and until communication is established, they're probably not going to like you. Maybe even after. Not everyone likes each other. Sometimes you're just not going to get along with people, and that's okay. You can move on and go your separate ways without trying to enforce laws and policies to harm one another or everyone. The case I'm thinking of is, of course, the recent one with Steven Crowder and Carlos Maza, I believe it was, on Vox, who basically just don't get along and have insulted each other and disagreed with each other for quite some time. And Carlos Maza decided to attack Crowder and try to get him banned from YouTube, going so far as to go to advertisers and try to get them to drop YouTube if YouTube didn't ban Crowder. Now, Crowder gets most of his funding through his mug club, subscription program. Most of his videos get demonetized almost right away, if not immediately. So this doesn't really affect Crowder, the person who Mazza disagreed with, so much as it does everyone else who's trying to make a living on YouTube, or who would like to in the future. And so it's these kinds of tactics that I think we should be looking at banning or taking action against. These types of actions that actually harm multiple groups of completely innocent people who are not attached to the situation at all, just in an attempt to get at one person you don't like. That is the type of being mean that I think we should do something about, because that hurts people in a very, very viable, understandable way. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be nice to one another when I say that we shouldn't have hate speech policies. I'm saying that if you and someone else can't be nice to one another, just do your best to avoid each other. If you work together, maybe one of you has to find another job. That's life. Or you can learn to live with one another. Usually, if you actually stop and talk to people about why they feel the way they do or why they act the way they do, some people, of course, won't open up. But if you can get them to talk to you, then I at least find it's usually pretty easy to come to some understanding, some common ground, even with people that when I first met I would have assumed I hated and disagreed with on all levels. But usually only through, well, a little bit of social contest, a little bit of back and forth. If our speech is regulated to the point that we can't have the initial unpleasant interaction to push through, then for the most part, I think people will just avoid talking to each other, which we're seeing in Britain, in the UK, as these hate speech laws happen. The number of adults who have no friends, there are actually call centers there whose purpose is just to take calls from lonely people in the UK who sometimes haven't spoken to another person in weeks, and they'll realize, it'd been 2 weeks since I had talked to another human being or even waved at a neighbor, just because of the solitary lives they're living, and it's unhealthy. So they call these call centers just to have some kind of human interaction, because human interaction is getting harder and harder as it becomes more regulated. At some point, we need to just let people be people. Now, this doesn't mean letting people attack each other. This doesn't mean that you can, throw shit at each other in the streets or harm one another. But sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Now, as I mentioned earlier in this video, words definitely can have an impact on people. And in some cases, that can lead to suicide. But in many cases, it can lead to bonds being formed, friendship, or just to people becoming stronger as they learn to move past the words that are thrown at them. Sometimes it is really true that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And sometimes that's not just talking about physical things. In the case of physical things, I think we should definitely know our limits, because you can break your body irreparably. I think that with the right help, almost any mind, other than people who are just born with chemical-induced mental illnesses, but when it comes to people who've just experienced things in their lives that were hard for them, or people who are depressed because of mean things people have said to them, I'm not saying it's an illegitimate way to feel. It's how I felt most of my life. And when I was younger, I even attempted suicide because of it on 3 occasions. But you become a stronger person because of it if you learn to move through. And words don't get to me now. There's nothing anyone can say to or about me that really makes me angry. Oh, their ideas can make me angry. When I hear people denying that there are rape gangs in the UK, grooming gangs who have been raping young girls, that angers me because, well, the idea of denying this kind of thing when it's been happening for years angers me. But the specific words used do not, and there's no insult someone could throw at me about me that would anger me, because I've become a stronger person because people were mean to me most of my life. I've never really found a group where I fit in to this day. So, this video is getting a little bit long, and it's gotten a little bit off topic. But hate speech laws are a step down a path I don't think we want to go. I think people need to be allowed to be happy, but also to hurt, and really just to experience each other and life on their own with as little regulation as possible. And I think that when we start regulating speech, we're taking away the last mostly safe way that people have to, well, get to know one another on a true level. If you start regulating what people can and can't say to each other, you don't change the way that they feel or think about each other. You just take away how much of it they can express, so people never really get to know each other because some of it has to stay hidden. There was an old show called Recess that I grew up with. Some of you might remember it. And if you don't, there's one episode that everyone growing up in this era should watch. I don't remember the name of it. I should have looked it up. I wasn't really planning on talking about it. But in that episode, the school outlaws, that decides to ban the word, I forget which word it was. I think it might have been crap or sucks. But basically, one of the lower swears got banned because I think it was crap, and because crap was basically just a fill-in for shit, then the school decided to ban it. No, maybe it was sucks. Maybe it was this sucks. But anyway, the main character of the show, TJ, only one of the main characters, decided to start using the word whomps. Because if you take away a word that people are using to express a certain feeling or emotion, they'll just make up and start using another one. And that was his point, was that you can't get rid of the idea. You can't get rid of the feeling being expressed when someone says this sucks or this whomps. You can only try to get rid of the words. And that just leads to the inflation or destruction of language. So how about we just don't, okay? Anyway, this has gone on long enough. Please be sure to like and subscribe and leave a comment below. I'd love to hear what you think. As always, I'm your host, Cipher. Thank you for watching the Devil's Advocate Debate Club.